All right, welcome to Chapter 6, Lecture 6 for the Kinesiology 158 Motor Learning and Control class. One of my favorite chapters in the book, Memory and Learning. Lots of interesting questions answered here, lots of interesting concepts talked about. Of course, we'll get into memory, talk about different aspects of memory, why we remember things, why we forget things. Some good stuff. So as usual, please check out these questions, explore them. I think answering them will help prepare you for any exams that you have coming up, or quizzes, or both. So first, let's start talking about memory. So memory, sort of general textbook definition, is the persistence of information over time. So you being able to recall information over a set amount of time. It defines our capacity to learn from experiences. If we didn't have memory, we would never learn, right? That just kind of makes sense. The term memory trace is used, and we've already mentioned it in this class once, but memory trace is thought of as a network of neurological cells encoded to store a specific memory. And we're not going to get into exactly how memories are stored and what those neurological cells are all about, but the idea is that, yes, we can store memories and then recall upon them whenever needed. It's also understood that there is no single center for memory, so that sort of memory is considered to be compartmentalized into various regions of our brain: the hippocampus, our frontal lobe, the motor cortex, which we've talked about. Talk a little bit about the hippocampus a little later in this discussion. And as you could, of course, expect, there are some theoretical perspectives on memory, and there's a cognitive-based theory that helps us better, or that we use to help better understand what memory is about. And so this idea of convergent centers, which we sort of touched on those previously, are these components of a retrieved memory come together at a specific location. So we have memory stored, maybe it's the motor cortex and hippocampus, and the information from them needs to come together somewhere in order for us to express or act upon, or at least recall, that memory or that learned task. This is considered a hierarchical process, so it's sort of a top-down thing. So obviously from the brain, central nervous system, and outward, and this very much sort of falls in line with the schema theory proposed by Schmidt, which we talked about a few chapters ago. So let's pick apart these memory systems. So if you look at the graphic on the right, it's kind of a sort of a tree that's split in half, but at the very top is memory, and then we have two sides. We have declarative and procedural memory. Procedural memory is not on the slide right now, but within memory we have two sort of branches, and the first one we're going to talk about is declarative memory. Declarative memory is memories concerning facts and events, so stuff that we know, kind of stuff that you can prove, sorta. So within declarative memory, we have what are called semantic memories, or semantic memory. And that's generalized knowledge about the world. It's, like the graphic says, it's, I know what a bicycle is. That's semantic memory. I know what a bike is. It has two wheels, it has some pedals, handlebar. I can visualize one. I've seen one. I know what it is. That's semantic memory, general knowledge. There's also the other branch within declarative memories is episodic memories. So this is sort of personal knowledge. Autobiographical, it's context and sequence related. The example they give here is that I remember my first bicycle. Oh yeah, I can remember that bike. It was red, had big handlebars. This is one, and as I mentioned earlier, these things can be proven. Well, it's possible for someone to think that they remember their first bicycle and be convinced that they remember their first bicycle, but what they're remembering is in fact not their first bicycle. And that's where memory gets a little bit cloudy, because that's not a memory. You've created a memory that doesn't exist. We don't go down that path in this class. So know the difference between semantic memories, I know what a bike is, episodic memories, I remember my own first bike. That's very personalized and autobiographical in nature. On the other side of the tree are what are called procedural memories. So procedural memories, the procedural memory system contains information relative to skill procedures. So it's information for all three domains of skill: the cognitive, the perceptual, and the motor domains. And this is sort of the doing part of memory, right? And so the example used from the graphic is, yeah, I can ride a bicycle, right? So you can know what a bike is, remember your first bike, but that doesn't actually mean you can ride it. So you have to have that declarative memory, the procedural memory, to support the declarative in order to actually write it. So these two sides of memory, right, these two branches of memory are very important and definitely have a relationship with one another. And so the doing of sort of skills, motor skills, requires that procedural memory. Declarative is not enough. You can know everything about anything, but it doesn't mean you can necessarily do it. An interesting example, and this is covered in the book, you should read about HM, it's an individual, and it sort of explores these memory systems and the fact that the declarative and the procedural memory systems are in fact separate, right? Because there is debate, and there has been debate, is there really a declarative and a procedural memory system, or is that just, is the procedural memory system just part of the declarative or part of just the overall memory, and just happens to be related to movement skills? Well, the situation with HM, and he had they talk about he had a medical condition, I believe is a severe form of epilepsy, and they removed his hippocampus. And what they gave him was something called anterograde amnesia. And for those of you that have seen the movie 50 First Dates with Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler, that movie was based on this anterograde amnesia. So it is a real thing from that movie. And so Drew Barrymore, the main character in that movie, had it. There's also a character, 10 Second Tom, who had a much more severe case of the same condition. They both have the same condition, just 10 Second Tom could only remember 10 seconds back in time, and then he would sort of reset and be back to square one and forget exactly everything that's happened up until 10 seconds ago. So what happened to H&M is, yes, when he had his hippocampus removed, he lost the ability to form or access new memories. And so the argument is also that, memories are being formed, it's just that we don't have access to them anymore or ever, and therefore it's as if they never happened. So we literally get stuck in time when if we experience this anterograde amnesia. So with HM, he lost, or he could only retain things for a few minutes, and then he would basically hit his reset button. Everything prior to his surgery, those memories were still intact. So he had the access to those memories before the hippocampus was removed, but everything after, gone in a few minutes. So really, he woke up every morning thinking it was 1965 when he had the surgery, when it was in fact 1985. And fact, right, I think he just died just in the last 5 years. I mean, he's a recent person. What was interesting, and at some point some researchers got a hold of Mr. HM and decided to do some experiments based on memory, and they had him perform some motor skills, try and learn some new ones, and he was in fact able to learn new skills. He forgot that he learned them, but he was able to perform them even though he didn't know he could, which was a really exciting discovery because it proved that the declarative and procedural memory systems worked independent of each other. Right? The removal of the hippocampus pretty much destroyed that declarative memory, right? His anterograde amnesia was on the declarative side of his memory, so to speak. But when challenging his procedural memory, in this case with HM, that was a pretty clever experiment, right? He was able to learn new motor skills, and that sort of at least provided some evidence that these two memory systems are in fact different or separated. So, all right, enough about H&M or HM. So still talking about memory systems, and let's get it into the context of sport a little bit. And so there's been some great research out there done in the context of sport, and a lot of it looks into this idea of choking. Why do athletes choke? Why do people not perform the way they're expected to under certain circumstances? What's going on there? And so a lot of studies done out there comparing novices to experts and their performances and their ability to recall their memory regarding sport and performance. And so Baylock and Carr conducted a study on golfers. And what they did was they took novice golfers and they took expert golfers. And they had them first just explain the procedures of like a good golf putt. I think it was a putt. I'm not sure. I think it was a putt, not a drive or anything like that. And that was pretty much an exercise that would challenge both the experts and novices' declarative memory. How much do you know about a golf putt? And the experts did fantastic. The novices, as you'd expect, didn't do quite as well. Then they had the golfers actually perform a putt, and they asked them afterwards to describe how that putt went. Like, okay, tell us exactly about how you performed that putt, and why it ended up being a successful or maybe unsuccessful putt. Surprisingly, the expert golfers could not recall nearly as much information as the novices. So the novices outperformed the experts when asked to recall a specific putt. And then finally, in this research, the golfers were told before they putted, you're going to be asked after this putt to recall the process that you went through to perform the putt. And when they did that, the same effect happened. The novices did a much better job of explaining the steps involved in that putt compared to the experts. So what the heck is going on there? Well, what the researchers concluded was that there's somewhat of an expertise-induced amnesia, meaning that experts, they don't rely on their declarative memory after a certain point of their skill development, in this case the golfers, and so them having to rely on declarative memory to explain something that they did doesn't really work. They are in such a procedural sort of place when they're performing, it's automatic, but when asked about the steps of the procedure, they can't do it. That's all that declarative memory. So this expertise amnesia was sort of, a term coined from this research. A good question to ask is, what does this suggest about expert players and coaching? And it's interesting, right? And surely some of you are coaches, or surely most of you have been coached in some way. Is it always the best player, or are the best players always the best coaches? Not necessarily, right? Someone who is incredible on the field or in the court or whatever it is may not have that declarative ability, right? They may not have that declarative memory to rely on to coach. Obviously, there's a lot more involved with coaching than just that, but it does sort of have that sort of at least explain something. It's like, oh, you're really good, but you're a horrible coach. Well, I don't know exactly how I do that. I just do it. So building on that, there's also this idea about choking and declarative memory. And so this expert monitoring hypothesis is basically a situation when people choke, part of what's going on is that pressure, right, under situations, right, under high pressure situations. I can always do it in practice, but in the game I just can't pull it off. Individuals who might be at a high level, maybe not, start to rely on their declarative memory to perform a task, and that takes away basically the ability, right? That harnessing of the declarative memory will disrupt their procedural memory, and so all of a sudden that free throw that you can do with your eyes closed in your sleep, all of a sudden you're thinking about it, going, oh, is my elbow up high enough? Is my all of a sudden you're thinking about the declarative aspect of the skill that contributes to this. Well, not the success, but the choking part of not performing. So that attention to detail on the declarative side has been used as an explanation for choking. This is just a graph of that Bylock and Carr study. And so, I won't spend too much time on it. This is in your text, of course, but just sort of that comparison of those three different situations. On the far left, that generic recall after practice condition. Yeah, tell me about a putt. And what a successful putt is. The green dashed line is the expert golfer, and the red is the novice golfers. The experts had much better semantic declarative memory of a putt, but then when they're asked in that middle condition to recall their own putt, the novices did much better, and then the same was true, even though the difference wasn't quite as great, even when they're told before they putted. So just sort of that comparison of, that once you get to that expert level, that declarative memory isn't something that's relied upon anymore. All right, so stages of memory. So you've surely heard the term long-term, short-term memory. Well, we're going to talk about those a little bit. Setting the stage, yes, to be aware of our environment and respond effectively, we need to have some certain things in place. First, we just need to know what's going on in our environment. We need to decide what to do in response, and we also need to know how to do what we decide upon, right? We've talked about those things already in class. Memory is what we rely on to successfully carry out those procedures. And so the Atkins and Shiffrin model of memory proposes three types of memory: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Let's talk about those. Again, you've probably heard of the short-term and long-term. Sensory memory is something that isn't as commonly discussed. So, Yeah, let's do this. I was going to put this at the end of the talk. So over the next series of slides, so we'll get back to memory, don't worry. This is just like your mid-lecture break, right? So over the next several slides, I'm going to show you a sequence of numbers. I don't want you to write them down. Don't pause the video so you can memorize them. Just play along. So attempt to memorize the numbers. I'm going to put them up for about 5 seconds, and then we're going to move on. Ready, set, go. All right. How many of you got it? Some of you might have got it. Some of you may have incredibly effective short-term memory. When we start talking about short-term memory in a few minutes, we'll talk about its capacity, and its capacity is about 7 items plus or minus 2. So 5 to 9 is sort of a typical short memory span. That was 12 numbers right there. Let's try it again. Let me give you another chance. Ready, set, go. All right. I imagine a few more of you are thinking, oh yeah, I think I got it now. Same numbers, same sequence. There's just 3 dashes put in there, right? Didn't change the number of digits or anything. Let's try it one more time. Ready, set, go. All right. I bet a majority of you got it, right? What changed? Well, the order of the numbers, so the numbers were still the same. It's the same number of numbers. The sequence in those groups of 4 numbers changed a little bit. And how did they change? Right? They became numbers that you had some sort of association with, right? 1776 was in there, 1969, and 1492. 1492 was what? Columbus. 1776, Independence. 1969, Man on the Moon, right? So all of a sudden, those 4-digit chunks became just a one date. And all of a sudden, we went from our short-term memory trying to remember 12 digits to just 3. Or 3 items of information. Sorry, there's 12 digits, but across 3 items of information. That process is called chunking, and it's a strategy a lot of people use to help train and practice memory and enhance their memory. Right? Memory is something that can be trained and get bigger, faster, stronger. Right? So that's the process of chunking, and it is a way to really take advantage of your short-term memory. And when we can find an association or a way to group items into a common sort of category or factor, all of a sudden 12 digits got whittled down into 3. Piece of cake. I can remember 3 dates. 12 different dates. Oh, that would be a little bit harder. So anyway, that's normally an in-class activity. That's a online class activity today. So all right, let's get back to our memory stuff. So we introduced sensory memory, long-term memory, short-term memory, at least as being things. Well, let's talk about sensory memory. Sensory memory is the organization, the prioritization, and the encoding of sensory information. And this is the sensory information, and this sensory memory is usually talked about in registers. And so for each sensory modality, we have a different register. And so vision, which is referred to as the iconic register, lasts for about 5 seconds. So something not 5 seconds, 0.5 seconds. That would not be good, right? So the register of vision, so an image in our vision, right, that we pick up visually can actually remain there for about 0.5 seconds. One of the good examples to test this is if you move something in front of your face really quickly, right, like a pencil, like move your pen or pencil, because I know you're all taking notes, right? Move that in front of your face real quickly. Do you just see one pen or pencil moving across, or do you see almost like a trail or multiple pens and pencils? And that's impossible. There's only one pen or pencil, or you can do your finger, right? But because that iconic register lasts for about half a second, that image sticks. But then at the same time, that pencil or whatever you're moving, as it moves, you're developing another snapshot of it, and all of a sudden you have multiple images stuck because your short-term memory, that iconic register, is holding on to the image of the pen when it was here, and then it picks it up as it continues to move. And so that's at least a way to look at, or at least identify, that you do have this sort of sensory memory that, it's there and then it's gone. On the touch side of things, the haptic register, that can last anywhere from a second up to 5 seconds. There's a question mark there. Some people argue there's no way it can last 5 seconds, but there's been some research that sort of says it can go longer than a second. I think your book says it goes up to a second, but if you're tested on it, it'll say up to a second. I don't think there's any questions that ask about your haptic register. It won't last. The book says 1 second. Just whatever the book says, go with that. Don't let my little stuff mess with you. So at least understand, yeah, sensory memory, very short-lived. It's only the memory required for our senses, whatever the sense is, to register that input and then relay that information to our brain, and then maybe that goes on into our short-term memory or even ultimately into our long-term memory. But really the purpose of that sensory memory is just to accept or at least receive that information from our environment and give us the opportunity to act upon it. Almost everything from our sensory memory disappears. We don't hold on to it. Too much stuff. So moving on to short-term memory. Short-term memory, information transferred from our sensory memory. So some information from the sensory memory will stick, right? Hey, I just saw, that was an incredible play, and I can visualize that athlete making that play again. Well, that at one point was in your sensory memory. Now it's stuck in your short-term memory for the next few minutes, right? And then maybe 10 or 20 years later, you can still remember that play. It's probably in your long-term memory, right? So short-term memory has limited capacity and time. Chunks, which is kind of what we just talked about a minute ago, right? The magic number for the number of items that our short-term memory can hold on to, somewhere in that neighborhood of 5 to 9, right? 7 is sort of the magic number, plus or minus 2. Short-term memory, pretty much 20 to 30 seconds, up to maybe 8 to 10 minutes. That's for the people who train it, right? And there are, you guys can go out there. There's apps out there now that help you with your memory. It's something you can work on. And as students, as human beings, right, there's some advantages to working on your short-term memory. Not just getting better at remembering people's names, right? So those of us who have horrible short-term memory, you meet somebody and literally 1 second later you forgot their name. You can work on that. That can be improved. There's strategies. So the short-term memory is the only memory system of which we are consciously aware. Sensory memory, not at all. And long-term memory, no, we have no idea. We can just recall stuff from the long-term memory. But the short-term memory, we can actively work on that, right? We know that it's there. And so they often call the short-term memory working memory. So let's talk about long-term memory. So long-term memory is the memory responsible for learning, ultimately. Its capacity appears unlimited, or at least we've not been able to find someone who's maxed out their long-term memory capacity. And so therefore we just assume it's unlimited. It includes the procedural and declarative sides of memory, and it also, and it also includes a process called encoding, right? And so that encoding process is how information from our short-term memory, right? Because everything at some point started in sensory memory, gets transferred to short-term memory, and then has to get what's called encoded to long-term memory. And so the process of encoding is making short-term memories into long-term memories. The way to maximize that, or the process that occurs, is, there's sometimes, but not always, a process of rehearsal. Yeah, so the short-term memory, it sticks around the short-term memory. Okay, your name is John, your name is John, your name is John. You can say it 3 times yourself. That's rehearsing the name. That's much more likely to get in your long-term memory, right? That's the tip of the day of learning names, right? Say it to yourself 3 times. And so there's some rehearsal. Attention needs to be paid to it, right? So if somebody says their name and you're paying attention to whatever's going on over there, the baseball game, you had to have paid attention. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to rehearse it. So, and then there should be some level of motivation to remember it. Yeah, it's important. I want to learn this person's name. There might be an advantage there. I'm not sure. There might be a good reason for me to do so. So here's a table from the book that just sort of compares the 3 memory systems, or 3 stages of memory. Nothing too exciting there. So the process of long-term consolidation, the process of encoding, getting things to stay in your long-term memory, it takes time. And so one thing is we can't always force things into the long-term memory right away. Um, so, 24 to 72 hours sometimes is necessary. When you're trying to force stuff in there, yeah, practice it, practice it, practice it, right? Some of you studying for exams, you can't just read it once an hour before. It's not going to stick in there long enough for you to perform on the exam. So you start studying a couple days before. Okay, I'm going to have an exam on Friday. Well, I'm going to start reading on Monday. And I know by Friday some of that stuff will have stuck, right? Some factors in influencing consolidation, yeah, the amount of practice, duh, right? You read it once, maybe it'll stick. You read it 10 times, much more likely to stick. Attention, motivation, we talked about those on the previous slide. Yeah, the more attention you pay and the more motivated you are to dedicate something or consolidate something to your long-term memory, the more likely it'll happen. Scheduling and presentation also have an effect. So how often you try to consolidate, so how much time and what your schedule is. Are you doing it 24/7, or are you just doing it for half an hour a day for a month, right? How are you scheduling it, and then how is it being presented to you? Obviously, you can probably come up with some of the Captain Obvious sort of things, but what type of presentation do you think is most likely to stick? The boring, mundane type, or the exciting, explosive, sort of firework type, right? So that presentation can really affect attention and motivation, and therefore affect long-term memory. So ways to enhance long-term consolidation. So this is good material, at least applied material, right? And so, this online environment's kind of funky. We don't have the platform necessarily to discuss things sort of spontaneously, right? And I might throw up a couple discussion strings during the term, but I'm not sure yet. But in the context of this, right, those of you who are coaches or even just teachers in general, or practitioners, parents, whatever you do, this is kind of cool information talking about enhancing long-term consolidation. When we look at practice sessions, and that doesn't mean not just practicing a sport, but even in a session in a classroom, or even a therapy session where you have somebody doing exercises that they need to be learning a new skill. There's this primacy recency effect, and it's a thing. And so this primacy is in reference to the very beginning of a session, and the recency is in reference to the very end of a session. And what has been discovered is that learning is greatest at the beginning and end of a practice session or a lecture, whatever it is, right? So in the beginning of this lecture, you guys are on it. Right now we're in the middle, you're probably going to forget this. But if this was the end, maybe you'd be more likely to remember it. So primacy recency just states that learning is greatest at the beginning and end of practice. So for you who are the coaches and the teachers and whatnot out there where you're working with people, sharing information, be mindful of that. Oh yeah, let's make sure we start things off with some good information, right? You can cram some of the good stuff in there, and then be mindful that towards the end, that last little segment, do it again, right? Introduce something really important. So that's primacy recency. More research into this area is like, well, God, that's kind of a bummer, right? This whole middle section, are we saying our probability of recalling stuff from the middle is going to be less than the beginning and end no matter what? It's like, no, there's something that's been discovered, this von Restorff effect. And basically, this is the exception to primacy recency, Captain Obvious kind of stuff. Particular, meaningful, or dramatic presentation in the middle of practice will lead to enhanced probability of recall. So yeah, in the middle of a practice session, in the middle of a lecture, in the middle of a therapy session, whatever it is, come up with a meaningful or dramatic presentation of new material, or maybe even the same material just presented in a more dramatic and meaningful sort of way. That will obviously then enhance that attention, that motivation, to increase that probability of recall. Yes, it's kind of obvious stuff, but it's good to know that it works, right? It's like, yeah, during practice, right, we're not going to just do the same thing the whole time. Let's insert some things that get the players motivated, get them focused, get them excited, so that they're more likely to recall what we practice. Talking about the practice itself, so practice distribution is also important to consider, and so lots of research on this. A lot of it isn't super realistic, especially speaking to a group of college students, and if you're college athletes, you don't have a choice. Your coaches don't really have a choice. And even at at the college level, club level, whatever you play, this isn't as much real world stuff, but it's at least good stuff to understand. Generally speaking, shorter practice sessions across longer periods of time enhance the potential to consolidate. So, if you can take a 2 hour session or 2 hours of material, but spread it out over 4 half-hour sessions with a nice break in between, you're going to probably be more effective at recalling that information versus just doing the whole 2 hour session at once. Um, the then priming effects is another strategy. And so priming effects is introduction of new information or skill before practice and then practicing it later. And so it's a strategy, again, that some people can take advantage of. Coaches do quite often, right? Hey, you're in the locker room or you're in the on the sidelines just getting dressed for practice. We're going to start talking about something we're going to do in practice later. This is a priming effect. Hey, today in practice, we're going to work on layups, right? We've never talked about layups before. Keep getting your shoes on, everything will be good, but let's talk about layups, and then later in practice you actually do it. That will increase the chances of that becoming consolidated. The emphasizing location cues. And so what's interesting in the process of performing a motor skill, it's been determined that focusing on the endpoint is the most effective way to consolidate the whole process. So not so much the starting position, but the whole process to the very end. So, using golf club swing maybe is the easiest on this. We want to focus on where the golf club head ends up. And that location cue is the most effective in relationship to other location cues, right? Where do you want to be in the middle of the swing? Doesn't do so much. Where do you want to be in the beginning? Not so much. Let's talk about the very end. Another strategy, sleeping on it, right? And this is the best one because now you're saying, wow, my teacher's telling me to go to sleep and I might be able to enhance my memory consolidation. Procedural memories, more so than declarative, procedural memories have a tendency to improve when there is sleep in between practice sessions. Sometimes it's been blamed on the fact that there might be a lack of sufficient or quality sleep, and when sleep is forced or introduced in that way, they're just more recovered and better able to perform. So there is some question as to how this happens, and really there's not any clarity exactly as to what's going on, but research has pretty consistently shown that sleeping on it is a thing. So, all right. So let's change gears a little bit. So we've talked about some strategies of how to make memory work better. What about when memory fails? So why do we forget? So forgetting is the loss or inability to retrieve information from memory. We all know what that's about. We've all taken tests, so we all know. Unless you've gotten 100% on every test, then you don't know what it's like to forget. So there's a couple things out there, the trace decay theory, and this applies applies only to sensory and short-term memory. Trace decay theory is basically, the memory trace doesn't form, right, or it doesn't stick, and so it decays before it becomes permanently encoded into long-term memory, right? That's a no-brainer. This conversation right now, you're not going to remember every word of it. At some point, every word that you hear me speak during this talk will be in your short-term memory, at least for a second, maybe, at least in your sensory memory. But that if you don't remember the whole thing, it's there is no reason for you to remember every word that I say. So they're just going to decay any of those traces that were picked up. In terms of long-term memory, that's a little bit more tricky, right? So long-term memory should be permanent, right? So one of the ideas is that there's interference theory. So memories and long-term memory might interfere with one another. So hey, I have a long-term memory about how to swing a golf club, but I've been playing tennis for the last 20 years. So I don't know, is my tennis memory now interfering with my golf memory? I'm not sure. So this interference theory has been looked at quite a bit, and there's some research on it. Similarity of the skill is one of the key factors, and there's two types of interference that are discussed. One is called retroactive inhibition, and the other is called proactive inhibition. So retroactive inhibition is when learning a new skill interferes with the retrieval of an old one. So the example I just gave you, right? I used to play golf, now I play tennis. Is tennis messing up my golf? Proactive inhibition is when old skills interfere with the learning of new one. Yeah, well, when I learned to play tennis, I just kind of kept doing like a golf swing when I was swinging the racket, so that old skill interfered with the learning of my new one. Um, Graphical representation of the two. Um, this is using badminton as an example, badminton and tennis, sorry. And so, yeah, the retroactive inhibition example, you practice tennis first, then you go to practice badminton, and at the very end, you practice tennis at the end. So, retroactive is where, yeah, you practicing badminton after already playing tennis is going to mess up with your tennis. Whereas a proactive, right, you play tennis, then you play badminton, and then you play badminton again. That tennis originally affected your ability to get good at badminton, right? And badminton and tennis are relatively similar, right? Two racket sports, you're hitting a moving target, ball or a birdie. That potential for inhibition there is quite large, right? If we're comparing tennis to soccer or badminton to volleyball, not so much potential for that inhibition to occur. So yeah, strategies for reducing interference, something to consider, right? And one of the things research has shown us is that if we can separate these similar skills, right? And so within sports, obviously there's a lot of similar skills practice, right? If you're a soccer player, there's different ways of kicking the ball and trapping the ball and that kind of thing. So the idea is with whatever sport you might have in mind or whatever set of skills, separate those similar skills as far apart as possible so you can learn one effectively without that interference of the other in either the retro or proactive type of way. The best strategy, if you have to choose one or the other, is to prefer a proactive rather than retroactive inhibition. So that old skill is that old skill, and now you're just practicing the new one, basically. That's the proactive approach. Um, Another idea, introduce new skills at the end of practice. Remember, we have the primacy recency effect. And also that minimizes the opportunity for that new skill to be interfered by an old skill. So again, different strategies for reducing interference. That is it for chapter 6. I'll see you next time.